Before you do that, one more thing. Okay, good. Just to tell you one little thing about Aljoya, Mercer Island, we're 114 apartments located in beautiful Mercer Island. Been here for 13 years, and it's just beautiful views and beautiful walking paths and independent living and also assisted living, and with great cuisine that we have here as well. Also, we're welcoming Dr. Abby Winter with us. She's going to give a talk today on Vaccines 101. You know, this is a forefront. Every time I watch the news, there's something about vaccines, something about that. So we need a little bit of clarification. So we went to the University of Washington, and Abby Winter graciously accepted to do this. So we're going to turn this over to you right now, Dr. Winter. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll go from there.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me get these slides shared. If I could get a thumbs up from someone that you can see the screen with the slides, great. So thank you so much for joining us today. As Larry said, my name is Abby Winter. I am a clinical assistant professor at the School of Pharmacy at the University of Washington. And then I also am the main pharmacist that is affiliated with Era Living. So we have a great partnership with the UW School of Pharmacy and Era Living, and where we provide educational opportunities like this, and also consultations if you have questions about medications and things like that. So it's just a really great opportunity to have some experts in your back pocket when you need them. So today we're going to be talking about Vaccines 101. As Larry mentioned, we've had vaccines all over the news lately, it seems. You can't turn on any sort of media without seeing something about vaccines. And though COVID vaccines have been definitely the focus, I think it's important that we understand and appreciate other vaccines that exist as well, that can be important for older adults. And then also we'll go through today how vaccines work, some of the development, the trials and things like that, so you have a better understanding of some of the background. So without further ado, we will, one other thing I wanted to mention. I am affiliated with the Pline Center at the UW School of Pharmacy, which is our Center for Geriatric Pharmacy, where we do research, education, and outreach. And the Pline Center also has Pline Scholars, where they do research projects and things like that. It's pharmacy students that do research projects, and some of them are also based at Era Living. So it's just another unique opportunity that we offer. So as I briefly alluded to today, we'll talk about how vaccines work, the history of vaccine development, different types of vaccines, an overview of vaccine trials, talk about efficacy and effectiveness, something we've probably all heard a lot about lately, and then vaccine recommendations for older adults. So first, let's do a little bit of digging to figure out how vaccines work. So to do that, I think it's important to understand how the body fights infection. So when a virus enters the body, it attacks your cells and multiplies, and that's what causes an infection. So the body's immune system is what helps fight that infection. Your white blood cells play a big role in that. And there are 3 types of white blood cells. We also call those immune cells. So 3 types of white blood cells that all work together to fight infection. They digest that germ or the pathogen, that virus that came in, the dead cells, the dying cells, and then they leave behind something that's called an antigen. The body sees these as dangerous and sends antibodies to then attack them. And so our body produces antibodies that will attack those specific antigens that are left behind after your immune system digests those pathogens and germs. The immune system attacks cells in the body that have already been infected as well to help get rid of that infection. So we can think of this in another way too. I say, picture someone trying to rob a bank. The germ or the pathogen is the robber, and the immune system is the bank. So the security camera, pictured here, catches the robber entering the bank and sets off the alarm. And so if we think of it in terms of our immune system, the white blood cells are the security camera. They notice that pathogen and set off the alarm. The alarm then notifies the security guards, and they find and detain the robber. So the white blood cell tells the antibodies and they find the pathogen or the germ. The bank then adds more security cameras, hangs up pictures of the robber so they don't come in again, or if they do, we know how to attack them or who to go after. And so the body, in the same way, creates memory cells to help remember that pathogen or remember that germ and how to get rid of it quickly if we encounter it again. So if you can kind of wrap your mind around this, it gives you a little bit of a different understanding. It's simplified, of course, but a different understanding of how the immune system works. So let's talk about memory cells a little bit. So with the first encounter, so the first time your body encounters a germ or a pathogen, it doesn't always set up a defense. It can take several days before that defense is built up, but then it creates these quote unquote memory cells so that upon future encounters, the immune system remembers, knows how to fight, and can protect the body. So if the same pathogen presents again, those memory cells quickly respond. So if we think back to our bank robber analogy, if we didn't remember what that bank robber looked like, the next time they come in, it's going to take us a little while to recognize who they are, what's happening, remember how to come up with a fight against them. But if we have posters up and we know what they look like and we remember that, as soon as they enter the building, we go to our plan of attack versus having to recall and set up a new plan. So with vaccines, we present the body with a weakened or inactivated or dead version of a pathogen or a germ, and it imitates the illness, but it does not cause the illness. So it's an imitation. We call it an imitation infection. And then that helps the body develop a defense because it's then able to recognize that pathogen and fight it off in the future. So our bodies develop immunity by imitating an infection. And we need that supply of memory cells produced by our immune system after vaccination because they remember how to fight the disease. And it can, as we've learned with the COVID vaccine and with flu vaccines, it can take a few weeks for the body to really produce enough memory cells after you get a vaccine in order to be effective. So just because you get a vaccine today doesn't mean you're necessarily protected tomorrow because the body has to build these memory cells and come up with that plan that it can recall for the future. So the importance of vaccines. Many people consider vaccines one of the greatest breakthroughs in modern medicine, and I tend to agree. They've helped combat deadly illnesses and sometimes even eradicating them. But we're only really able to reach the full potential of a vaccine with eradication if enough people are vaccinated. Now, your brains might be going to COVID with this, which is definitely warranted, but it holds true for a lot of other illnesses as well. In general, vaccines are safe, and often we only have minor side effects for the majority of the population. So next, I'd like to talk about herd immunity. That might be something that we've heard of. Perhaps we heard about this a little bit more early on in the pandemic when this was our goal with COVID. It still is our goal, but our mentality of how we approach it might have adjusted a little bit. So there's three things that come into play when we talk about herd immunity: getting people vaccinated against the illness, people who have had it and recovered, and that's only true for some pathogens. And while your immunity that comes after having the illness can definitely be helpful, and with some pathogens that immunity can wean after a period of time, sometimes it's lifelong. So it really is germ dependent. And then the other factor that we need with herd immunity is no additional human source for spreading the pathogen. So human sources are also how we get mutations in different pathogens that then continue to cause illness. So enough people have to have developed protective antibodies against future infection. And herd immunity is important because it helps people who can't get vaccinated. Our young kiddos, our vulnerable adults, there are a lot of people who cannot get vaccinated. Not that they choose not to, but they cannot. And so anyone who is eligible getting vaccinated protects our other community members. So let's talk about eradication. Technically, we have eradicated smallpox. That's really the only thing worldwide that has been eradicated. And I think it's important to note that the smallpox vaccine was first developed over 225 years ago but it took until 1980 for the WHO to declare it eradicated. And that was even with a really great uptake of the vaccine. So it's definitely possible, but it's a long journey sometimes, especially if we can't get everyone on board with vaccination. We are extremely close with eradicating polio. It has been declared eradicated in the United States, but as we know, viruses, pathogens, germs don't really know borders. They don't know country borders. And with so much travel, we know that there's a chance that those things can continue to spread in other countries. So having folks in our country vaccinated as much as possible is great, but it needs to be a worldwide effort as well. And then here's a list of other things that are nearly eradicated. And you'll see influenza on there. We're talking about, there's a lot of different strains and types of influenza. So that's not necessarily like the common flu that we think of with seasonal influenza, but measles, mumps, rubella, tetanus, pertussis, diphtheria, that bacterial influenza that we talked about. And so these are quote unquote nearly eradicated. But as you may have noticed in the news and the media lately, when folks opt to not get some of these vaccines, it can lead to outbreaks. So having more people vaccinated against these things that we believe to be nearly eradicated is still really important, so that if there's one human that is able to have that infection or spread it, it doesn't spread across a large breadth of the community. So let's talk about the history of vaccine development. So there's a lot of information listed here, but it's mostly just to kind of give you a visual representation of the timeline of the development of different human vaccines. So we can go all the way back to 1798 when smallpox started, the smallpox vaccine was started. And we've got a list of all of these up until 2013 with group B meningitis. And we can add COVID to that list now. So we have to look at the history of diseases to kind of understand some of the vaccine history. So back in the 1500s was when we first saw the smallpox epidemic in India. We then also saw whooping cough, which is also called pertussis. It's the P in your Tdap or DTAP vaccines. We then in the 1600s saw early cases of typhoid fever, Spanish diphtheria, and smallpox came to North America. So there are some sources who say that back in 200 BC, there was a quote unquote inoculation-like practice where Buddhist monks would drink snake venom to try to provide immunity against snake bites, which is the same concept as a vaccine essentially. But the modern day vaccination or inoculation that we think of started back in the 1600s. There was a Chinese emperor who survived smallpox as a child, and then he chose to have his children inoculated by grinding up the scabs of other folks who had smallpox and blowing it into the nostrils of his children and other people. Or they would take the matter from a smallpox sore and scratch it into the skin. So vaccines have come quite a long ways, but that was one of the earliest ideas of vaccination, and that provided folks with immunity against smallpox later on because it introduced their body to a weakened version of it or to the pathogen itself, so the body could mount a response against it if it found it in the future. In the 1700s, we even have reports of what they called at the time an operation, where they'd put a little bit of smallpox matter, so like from a scab or something, on the head of a needle and put it into the vein of different patients. But then in 1774, that's when the real inoculation started, where this farmer inoculated his family with cowpox, and that provided them with protection from smallpox. So cowpox doesn't infect humans, but the viruses are very similar, that it provided protection against smallpox. And so we call them vaccines because the cowpox that they used contains the vaccinia virus. So they used the name of that to coin the term vaccine. All right, so bouncing back, let's look at some different types of vaccines. We've heard a lot about types of vaccines lately with our new mRNA vaccines, but there are a lot of other types and a lot of different technology and science that goes into developing different types of vaccines and figuring out what's going to work best for different pathogens. So we'll go through these one by one. First is live attenuated vaccines. So these contain a weakened version of a living virus or bacteria, but it's so weak that it cannot cause serious illness or disease in people who have a healthy immune system. For some folks whose immune system might be weakened, their body might mount a little bit of a response because it's not as strong to fight off that really, really weak virus. But for the most part, it doesn't cause illness. Live attenuated vaccines are really good teachers for the immune system, and they're the closest thing that we have to natural infection, which some believe to be really, really helpful with protection. So the MMR vaccine, the chickenpox or varicella vaccine, yellow fever, rotavirus, and the old shingles vaccine. We had a new one that came out a few years ago, but those are all examples of live attenuated vaccines. Again, the important thing to remember though, they cannot cause illness in the majority of adults with a healthy immune system. Next are inactivated vaccines. So these contain an inactive or a dead form of a pathogen. Again, it cannot cause illness. And it produces a different type of an immune response than the live attenuated vaccines do. And sometimes with these, they require multiple doses to build that immunity or maintain that immunity. So some examples are the inactivated polio vaccine, the rabies vaccine, or hepatitis A. And next we have toxoid vaccines. So these are a little bit more complex, but toxoid vaccines work against diseases that are caused by bacteria that produce toxins in the body. So these vaccines create immunity to a part of that pathogen that causes the disease, not necessarily against the pathogen itself. So they contain weakened toxins, which we call toxoids. And again, these cannot cause illness either. So when you're exposed to a toxoid, the immune system learns to fight off the natural toxin. So we're kind of manipulating it a little bit to learn how to fight the original concern. And the best example of this is a DTAP vaccine, which has diphtheria and tetanus toxoids in it. Next, recombinant subunit polysaccharide and conjugate vaccines. So there's multiple types, but they all work similarly and have the same concept. They use pieces of the pathogen. So they look just at the protein or the sugar or the casing of the virus or the pathogen in order to create a response. So the vaccine then targets that very key part of the germ. And that results in a really strong immune response because we're not just trying to attack the whole thing. We say, if we can weaken the powerhouse of it, if we can weaken the casing of it, and then everything falls apart, then we know we're going to get rid of it. These are safe for folks with weakened immune systems, but we do often need booster shots to get ongoing protection. So a few examples of these, the HIB, which is a type of influenza B, hepatitis B, HPV, which is human papillomavirus, whooping cough, which is the pertussis or the P in our Tdap vaccine, pneumococcal, meningococcal, and the new shingles vaccine are all vaccines that were developed to target parts of that pathogen. Next is our DNA or mRNA vaccines. So we put these in together, not to confuse, because I know there's some misinformation going around about these mRNA COVID vaccines altering DNA, but that is not something that happened. So this mRNA vaccine is actually decades old technology, but the vaccines that we have that use this technology are newer. So even though the vaccine itself is new, the science is decades old. Which is reassuring that they've been studying this for a while. We just haven't had the need or the push really to get something to market until the last couple of years. So these vaccines make proteins that trigger an immune response, and it provides the cells in your body with instructions, like a blueprint of how to make the antigen. And one of the really great things about these mRNA vaccines, as we've seen, is the manufacturing time is much shorter than it is compared to other types of vaccines. They also do not have a risk of causing disease. And currently the only example we have is the COVID-19 vaccines, a couple of them. And then lastly, we'll look at viral vector vaccines. So these use a modified version of a different virus as a vector to deliver protection. So they may use the influenza vaccine or VSV or measles or adenovirus And then it helps bring that different virus in to provide protection. So scientists have been studying these for decades as well. And one thing that they have found is that there's a possibility of them being a little bit less effective if you've been exposed to the virus that we're using as the vector. But for the most part, these are very effective. There is a COVID-19 vaccine that is a viral vector vaccine. And then we're currently using, not myself, but we as a scientific community are using this technology to study Ebola, Zika, HIV, and flu. Right. So next, let's look at some vaccine trials and understanding what goes on with those. Vaccines undergo a lot of safety testing. They're held to very high safety standards. There's testing before they're approved or recommended, and then there's ongoing testing and observational testing after they're approved. So before approval, we look at lab testing, and that often takes years, and then we determine if it's okay to test it in people. So there's different stages. We have exploratory, preclinical, the clinical development, regulatory review and approval, and then manufacturing quality control, which is ongoing. So let's look at our clinical trials. That's where they evaluate the safety and effectiveness with actual human volunteers. So they're no longer just working in the lab, they then go to humans. And it helps answer the questions. Is the vaccine safe? What dose is best? And how does the immune system react to the vaccine? So there are different phases. We start with phase 1, which is just a small group of healthy people, 20 to 100 people most of the time, and make sure it's safe. And then we expand it. That's where we use folks who represent what we call the intended audience. So if it's someone who might be at higher risk of a certain disease or illness. Phase 3 then includes thousands of people. And that's where we test for true efficacy and safety because we have a much bigger population. So we have a chance of discovering any of those rare side effects or rare things that may occur. And then phase 4 are the ongoing studies after something's approved. And that happens with a lot of our drugs and vaccines anyway. They always try to look at heart benefits or risks after the fact. So once something's approved, it's sort of reassuring to know that they're continuing to monitor and study the safety after the fact. So let's look at vaccine testing. Once it's approved or authorized, as I mentioned, the testing does not stop. And that is something that's always been going on. Every batch of vaccines is tested for potency. So that means, does it work like it's supposed to? Is it potent enough? It has the ingredient it's supposed to have in the right amount. They check for purity. So does it contain the ingredients that are supposed to be removed, that are used during production, that are supposed to be removed? Did they remove them? And then they check for sterility to ensure that there's no additional outside germs or anything like that. The FDA also tests the actual factories where the vaccines are made or manufactured to make sure they follow quality and safety standards, and that's ongoing as well. So we may be a little more familiar these days with the tracking of side effects with something called VAERS, which is VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. It's a national vaccine safety surveillance program co-sponsored by the FDA and the CDC, and they collect and analyze information from adverse event reports. So there's pros and cons to this because anyone can provide a report. Anyone can log in and say, I had this adverse event. That's a great thing because patients can do it, providers, parents, pharmacists, vaccine manufacturers even. But it also can be a little bit worrisome because anyone could log in and provide false information. For the most part, we can trust that this is trustworthy because what they will do is then if there's enough reports of a certain effect or a serious enough effect, they go in and study it to see if there's any causation, not just coincidental occurrence. Let's look at efficacy versus effectiveness. So those words sound really similar. We've maybe heard them a lot lately, but it's important to denote the differences. Efficacy is the percent reduction in disease incidence. So how many people got the disease, how many fewer people got it in a group of vaccinated people compared to a group of unvaccinated people. The key point here is it's under ideal and controlled conditions. So let's briefly look at what those ideal conditions look like. So patients who have no other chronic conditions or illnesses, their vaccines were dosed on time. They had no missed doses. They're on no other medications most of the time. They monitored their side effects very closely with daily journals. And often we don't have those age extremes. So we're not always looking at our older adults or oldest older adults or our younger kiddos. Effectiveness is the ability of a vaccine to prevent the outcomes of interest. So usually hospitalization, death, or even just getting the illness itself. But that's in our real world scenario. So we measured this with our observational studies. So in the real world, we have a lot of different factors that can impact whether or not this vaccine may be effective. Patient's age, if they have other conditions, maybe they've previously been exposed to the disease of interest, or the time since they've been vaccinated can change. The vaccine itself can also play a role based on how it's delivered into the body. We have some oral vaccines, we have some injectable, that sort of thing. Some into the muscles, some injected into the fat. And then the type of vaccine, is it live, is it inactivated, and what the vaccine is made of. All of those factors play a role as far as how effective a vaccine is. Additionally, especially when we look at some of these seasonal vaccines, like the flu vaccine, we need to know whether or not the vaccine matches the strains or the variants that are circulating. So with our flu shot, every year, we come up with a different flu vaccine because there are so many strains or types of flu that can cause influenza. And we try to do our best to match the top 3 or 4 strains that we think are going to impact the community each year. And the vaccine matches that. Every year, the flu vaccine efficacy varies between 40 and 60%, which is kind of nuts when we're thinking about what we are maybe used to seeing with COVID, upwards of 90% efficacy. But knowing that the flu vaccine, even with just 40 to 60%, saves thousands of lives every year, that's still an incredibly effective vaccine. We've just been a little bit spoiled with these upwards of 90% with some of the vaccines that have been in the media these days. It's important to note, though, that no vaccine is 100% effective. The FDA set a 50% efficacy cutoff when they were deciding whether or not they would provide authorization or emergency authorization for the COVID vaccine. So they said, as long as it reaches 50%, we know it's going to provide a lot of protection. And that 50% means that it prevents disease or decreases the severity of the disease in at least 50% of people who are vaccinated. And we would consider that a pretty effective vaccine. So the fact that we got upwards of 90% is really wonderful. So now let's look at some vaccine recommendations for older adults. As we age, our immune systems weaken over time, no matter what we do. It's just an unfortunate reality. So this can make it a little more difficult for us to combat infections and illnesses. And it also can increase our susceptibility to complications from preventable diseases. So if there is a disease that has a vaccine and we're not getting it, you're not just putting yourself at risk of getting the illness, but as you age, the chances of having additional complications that come from just that illness itself, that risk goes up. So let's look at a few specific vaccines. First is shingles. The shingles vaccine is called the Shingrix vaccine. Shingles itself is a painful skin rash. It's caused by the virus that's also responsible for chickenpox. So if you've had chickenpox in the past, you are at risk for developing shingles because that virus lives dormant in your body and then can be triggered to cause an infection later on in life. Often what we see triggering it is an incredibly stressful event or another illness or something like that. So who should receive the Shingrix vaccine? All adults 50 and older, and there's no maximum age, which is a good thing to note. It is 2 doses separated by anywhere from 2 to 6 months, and it has been shown to be more than 90% effective. When the new Shingrix vaccine, the new shingles vaccine called Shingrix came out, there were some difficulties with pharmacies obtaining it because it was such a hot commodity. Because even folks who had the old shingles vaccine are supposed to get the new one because it's so much more effective. But nowadays, there's a much steadier supply of this vaccine at your pharmacy or doctor's offices. But with that, they did come up with some newer recommendations. If you can't get it within 6 months, we can stretch that a little bit. So always talk to your doctor or pharmacist if you have questions about the timing or if you're uncertain if you have met that time frame for your vaccines. Next, let's look at pneumonia. So pneumonia, there's multiple types and even a third one that has just been approved. There's the Pneumovax 23 and Prevnar 13. So pneumococcal disease, which is our pneumonia, can cause severe infections throughout the bloodstream and your organs. We often think of it in your lungs primarily. But the pneumonia vaccine helps prevent against that. So anyone 65 and older should get a pneumonia vaccine. If you are between the ages of 19 and 64 and you have some other certain conditions, or if you are a smoker, then you should also receive the pneumococcal vaccine. And then if you get it before you're 65, once you turn 65, as long as it's been 5 years later, you do get a second one. But for the most part, after 65, just one. Again, these two different types of pneumonia vaccines are intended for different populations. So it's important that you talk to your doctor or pharmacist about which one is appropriate for you. There was a question here that said, is Shingrix once in a lifetime immunity? Yes, for now, the Shingrix vaccine, it's a 2-dose series, but once you get that, then you are good. You don't have to get another one later on. Again, there's always ongoing studies and ongoing assessment of how effective the vaccine is and that sort of a thing. So we may see changes in the future, but it's not extremely likely. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so our next one is influenza. Influenza, the vaccine we think about is the flu shot. So influenza or the flu is a viral infection of the lungs, nose, and throat. It can be deadly. Often we think of the flu as like a stomach flu or a bad cold, but that's not what influenza is. Influenza is its own potentially deadly virus that is different than a cold, but much more severe. It's especially high risk for older adults and young kiddos, or those who are immunocompromised, who are considered high risk. So who should get the flu shot? Anyone 6 months of age and older. There's really not many, if any, contraindications or reasons someone shouldn't get a flu shot. And you should get one every year. It's a seasonal vaccine because, as I mentioned before, the strains that we cover change each year. So if you got last year's flu shot, it lasts a little bit longer than a year. It doesn't give you as good of protection as it does in those first few months after getting it. But the strains that it's protecting against are not going to necessarily be the strains that we expect to see a lot of in the community the following year. So a new flu shot every year is extremely important, especially if you're going to be around people who are high risk, including those young kiddos or older adults. I'm going to look at our tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis, or Tdap vaccine. So tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis are all serious illnesses that are preventable by vaccination. Diphtheria and pertussis can spread super easily from person to person. And tetanus, as you may be familiar, can enter the body with a cut or a wound or something like that. So all adults should receive the Tdap vaccine. Booster shots are also recommended for this one every 10 years. Or if you get a serious cut or wound, or you step on a nail or something, or if you're planning to be around a newborn baby, it's important to often get a booster a little bit sooner. And every pediatrician will recommend different things with that too, or depending on accessibility and cost and that sort of thing. But knowing that a booster at least every 10 years is what's recommended. And then lastly, but perhaps right now, most importantly, are COVID-19 vaccines. So SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 is an infection that is caused by this newly discovered coronavirus. I don't know how much longer we'll call it newly discovered, but within the last couple of years, I'd say that's still new. And as we know, it can cause respiratory illness that can spread from person to person through respiratory droplets. It's recommended that all people ages 12 and up, except now, as you'll be able to tell, this presentation was made prior to earlier last week, when we now have emergency authorization for ages 5 to 11 as well for one type of our vaccine. But with COVID-19 vaccines, there are very, very few contraindications. There's not a lot of health conditions or things like that that would make us say that someone should not get the vaccine. Millions of people have received them now, and they've been proven to be safe in the overwhelming majority of folks. And it can be safely administered to most people with underlying medical conditions. All right, I know we've gone through a lot of information here, but if there are any additional questions that have come up, I am happy to take the time now to answer those.
Yes, Dr. Winter, it's Larry over here.
Hi.
Hi. So it looks like within a year, we could put in our bodies the flu shot or the influenza, the COVID, the pneumonia, shingles. How's our body intertwined with all these different things? Are they safe to combine all those in a year?
That's a great question. So a couple of things to note. If you haven't had some of these vaccines, you may get multiple at the same time or within a year. But for the most part, shingles, you would just get one time after the age of 50. Pneumonia, you would just get one time after the age of 65. Flu shot is every year. COVID right now, we're not quite sure. There's maybe 2 up to 3 in a year. They're depending on the type of vaccine, a lot of them can be administered at the same time. Initially, when the COVID vaccines came out, they said to separate it from your flu shot by 14 days. That was just because we didn't quite know, and it wasn't flu shot season yet when those first came out. But now the CDC has said, absolutely okay, get them at the same time. I'll tell you, my mother got her COVID booster and flu shot just yesterday at the same time in the same arm. I might recommend different arms just because both can cause some arm soreness, but the CDC has said that it is okay to get COVID and flu for sure together. And some of the importance there is just making sure that you actually get them. If you're in the office or at the pharmacy for one of them, go ahead and get the other, rather than risk maybe not coming back or having to find another appointment time. If you can get them both at the same time, do it. Sometimes with live vaccines, we don't want to give multiple live vaccines at the same time, but those are very few and far between that you would get regularly. So as long as they're inactivated or mRNA or some of those other types of vaccines, getting them at the same time is definitely okay. Same with like your Tdap booster, your tetanus shot. Those are okay to get at the same time as like a flu or COVID vaccine. Again, the only side effects I'd be most concerned about, it might make that arm pretty sore. I know before I got my COVID vaccines, the tetanus shot was pretty painful. And that was what I would say gave you a really sore arm. But now I feel like the COVID vaccine, at least for me, takes the cake as far as arm pain. But that would be the only thing. And then the reason I suggest different arms is just in the rare occurrence or event that you have a side effect or something like that, then we'd know which one caused it. It looks like there's a couple in the chat. So I'll take those right now. Can you explain the approval hierarchy? There are committees, FDA, CDC, emergency approval, et cetera. Who's the final voice? Those are great questions. So as we've seen in the media and that sort of thing lately, so the FDA is the one that approves the actual drug product itself for use. They utilize the input from a lot of other organizations, a lot of other committees and that sort of thing to help them determine how it should be rolled out or in what specific populations or who it's recommended for. So the FDA approves the actual product itself, and then a lot of those committees help decide who should get it and when and how and that sort of a thing. So like the ACIP is the main committee that we're looking at right now as far as helping us decide how to get those out into the public and who should get it. And the CDC, the director of the CDC is also kind of giving that there's multiple types of, I guess, final approval. It's kind of a complex hierarchy as you've outlined in the question itself. But the FDA approves the actual drug and gets that product out into the market. So that's how I think of that. And then the committees are the ones that make the recommendations as far as who should get them. And then this next question, do they test for long-term effects of vaccines? Yeah, as we mentioned, there's that ongoing monitoring of side effects that even vaccines that have been around for 40 years, we're still monitoring for side effects every time someone gets one. And that's where there's the vaccine adverse event reporting comes in, that if you get a vaccine that was approved 40 years ago today, but you have a side effect tomorrow, you can still report that, or your doctor can report that. And then they're continually monitoring vaccine manufacturing to make sure those things are safe as well. But it same goes with any drug. If there's rare side effects or anything from a drug, that gets reported most of the time by your doctor. If they're adverse effects, I'd say side effects, I took this antibiotic and I got an upset stomach, we're not going to report that to the FDA. But if something very serious were to occur with a vaccine or a drug, it does get reported. Good questions.
I have a quick question, if I may, Dr.
Please.
Winter. Yeah. Is the chickenpox vaccine the same as the shingles vaccine?
Great question. It is not. The chickenpox vaccine is the varicella vaccine. Okay. And that one is the one that we're now giving to younger kiddos. I think it's kind of interesting. I think folks born like after the 90s or so, they aren't familiar with what chickenpox is
Right.
because they don't get it anymore. I know when I was young, you'd even send your kids over to a chickenpox party, right? Because you want them to get it. And now we have this vaccine. It's kind of wonderful that we're not as worried about that anymore. But no, the chickenpox or the varicella vaccine is different than the shingles vaccine.
So that being the case, then someone that's vaccinated with the chickenpox vaccine, would they be required later on in life to get the shingles vaccine?
Not usually. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the thing, because unless you've been infected with chickenpox in the past, your risk of shingles is very, very low, because it's that chickenpox virus that kind of sits dormant in your spine and can be brought on to cause shingles later on. So if you've never had the chickenpox virus, that mechanism doesn't work, right? So for right now, that's not a recommendation to get that if you've had the vaccine before. But for most of our older adults, they've had chickenpox in the past, or maybe they just had some natural immunity to it. But
Sure.
The shingles vaccine is recommended.
Okay, thank you.
Question here in the chat. Not sure how long since our last tetanus shot. Is there a problem with getting it sooner than 10 years? Great question. Not a problem at all. I know I got my booster at, my regular 10-year, and then my sister was pregnant, so I was going to be around her newborn, so I got one 3 years later, and then a few years after that I was pregnant, and I got one when I was pregnant 3 years later. So I've had like 3 or 4 tetanus shots in the last 10 years, and that's definitely okay. Those boosters are helpful and very minimal side effects besides that small arm the sore arm. And often if you go to the doctor for like a wellness check and you don't know when your last tetanus shot was, they'll probably give you one. We also say if you have like you step on a rusty nail or you get a really bad wound or something like that, and you don't know when your last tetanus shot was, we give you a tetanus shot. So it is okay to get it sooner than 10 years. And there are actually times where we recommend that you do so. So if you're not sure, I'd say best to get that booster because again, the side effects are incredibly minimal other than that sore arm. Great question though.
Does that apply to the DTAP vaccine as well, where you could get it earlier than 10 years?
That's the DTAP, Tdap. They're all the same components and have the T is tetanus, the D is diphtheria, the P is pertussis. It's just a matter of which ones we give to younger kiddos, which ones we give to older adults or adults in general, and the capital letters versus the small letter tell us if it has more or less of certain ones. And so your pharmacist or your provider will find the right one for you. But they're similar because they have the same components, just in different amounts and that sort of a thing.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Yeah. What
Also,
other questions?
Another question is that you mentioned the sore arm. but everyone is affected differently. Like some people get a sore arm, some people get a headache, some people get fatigue, some people get ill. So what's happening to the body when why do you get that sore arm? It's
Good
not from the
question.
needle because it doesn't hurt. The needle, there's a little prick and it's done, but what's happening?
Yeah, so it's a few different things. So some of it is actually just from the injection itself. Even though the needle might not hurt right away, it can hurt later. I kind of think of it like, maybe you exercise or work out or lift weights for the first time in a while. You're not going to feel sore right away. You usually feel sore the next day, right? It takes your body a little bit of time to respond to that. So some of it is just the actual physical, I don't want to say injury, but physical injury to the muscle that can cause a little bit of soreness. But then the other thing is it's your body really going to work really hard. I'm simplifying it, but your body is going to work and seeing this and saying, oh, I need to react to that. And I need to put all my energy into creating a plan to be able to fight this off in the future. So it is just your body having a minimal kind of that mimicking or mimicking that infection, that fake infection on a very small scale to try to build that memory and build that future response. And so that is a way to think of it and why we kind of have those reactions. And so it depends on the vaccine you're talking about. Again, every person does react a little bit differently. It depends on how your immune system's reacting, depends on how you're feeling that day. What other things might be going on. If you're distracted, you don't notice a couple of side effects you have. There's so many things that come into play, but it's your body mounting that immune response to the vaccine itself so that it can remember for the future that some folks have a little bit stronger reaction than others. That doesn't mean that your immune response is any weaker if you don't have these side effects, but because we all can respond so differently. So it's pretty complex, and some of it is even above and beyond my understanding of it all. But the way I think of it to explain to patients is that it is your body mounting that immune response, and everyone's immune system reacts a little bit differently when it does that, which is why our side effects can be a little bit different.
Interesting. Also, we just in the community here, we received our flu shots as well. And there's a certain age, I believe it's 65 maybe, that there's a dose for under 65 and there's a dose for over 65. So what is the difference between the two doses?
Great question. So once you reach age 65 and older, there are two types of flu shots that are actually preferred because studies have shown that it helps you mount a stronger response. A lot of this is because we know the flu shot, we know influenza can be much more serious and more deadly in our older adult population. So you either would get flu ad, which is what we call an adjuvanted vaccine that has kind of just a little bit of a boost in it, we'll say, or the high dose, both of which provide the appropriate additional immune response that we want in our older adult population. So if anywhere you go and you tell them your age, they should give you the appropriate either adjuvanted flu ad or high dose flu zone vaccine for 65 and older.
And some people may get a reaction to that as well, too, correct? As far as
so the side effects are pretty similar to the standard dose flu shot. Again, with the flu shot, the side effects are quite minimal. Some people will say, I got the flu after I got the flu shot. You either were pre-exposed to it and your body was just in that phase where it was building a response to it. Or since we know it can take a couple of weeks before you get full response or immunity from the vaccine itself, if you get exposed within 2 weeks after getting the vaccine, you may get the flu because the vaccine hasn't had a chance to do its job yet. So sometimes those side effects can be a little bit worse, but it is not anywhere near as bad as what the actual flu can be. And that's one of the risk benefit analysis that we do is the risk of the illness itself versus the risk in the vaccine. And overwhelmingly, the risk of influenza itself is much worse than any side effects someone would get from the vaccine.
Interesting. Also, when the COVID came out, like within a year, we had the vaccine. I mean, why was that so quick? How did they know what to do? I mean, you mentioned all this since back to 1600s. Been working on, but aren't you amazed? Well, I'm amazed at how quickly it came out, and we're lucky we have it because I believe a lot of people were saved because of that. So
Yes.
how
Yeah.
how were
So
they able to ramp up so fast and find that,
yeah.
out, get it approved and get it going?
Yeah. And so I will tell you this, just a little caveat. This is not my area of expertise, COVID vaccine development or anything, but I believe I find the appropriate sources to get the information. So a couple of factors at play there. Number one, mRNA vaccine technology, as I mentioned in the presentation, has been around for decades. They've already been studying this and they have that sort of their template and their schedule of what they need to do ready to go. And then when COVID came along, they as soon as it was identified in China, actually they got kind of the code they needed to be able to provide this type of vaccine. And that's one of the benefits of the mRNA vaccine, is that the manufacturing time is so quick because we have this baseline technology. We just need to input a couple of pieces of information, excuse me, to be able to provide this vaccine product. That's number one. Number two, because of the nature of this global pandemic, we were able to bypass a lot of the bureaucratic red tape that comes along with approval of drugs and approval of vaccines. So I tell folks it's not something that we should be worried about that it came through so quickly. If anything, we should be frustrated or a little upset or put off by the fact that it normally would take so long because we have so many different things to go through. So I think of it this way too. There's normally phases of these trials that we do. With the COVID vaccines, a lot of them we did phase 1 and 2 together, or 2 and 3 at the same time. So rather than doing phase 1, submitting the results and it goes to the bottom of the stack and has to work its way to the top of the pile, then it gets reviewed, and then you get approval to start phase 2, and then they do phase 2, and then they submit their results and it goes to the bottom of the stack and has to work its way to the top over and over and over again. Instead of that, two things happened. They did a couple of the phases concurrently, so at the same time. And then when they submitted their results, it didn't go to the bottom of the stack, it went to the top of the stack. So when it normally would take months to get approved or to get reviewed, they were doing it in a couple of days because of the importance of this. So that's one of the ways that this approval happened so quickly. And we had so many great minds working together at the same time for the common good to come together and do this. So yeah.
And then
There's
one final question. That's very good. And so interesting. We could be here for hours, but we all have time limits. But one question is, we just got through COVID, or getting through COVID. Then we had Delta. And if something comes, the next one in the pipeline comes in, would they think this vaccination that we did will cover, or would they have to develop a new one, or
Yeah, good
what are they
question.
I'm sure they're looking in the future.
Yeah.
Protecting the whole world. Nobody has a crystal ball, but what's happening with that?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. So there are definitely, as we've seen in the media as well, some they do studies of different variants as they come out to see how effective these vaccines are. And that's where it's also kind of interesting to look at that efficacy versus effectiveness. So we can't, we're not as much looking at these variants in the test tube, we're looking at it out in the real world. So our efficacy reports are going to seem much lower than they did when these vaccines were first approved. When they're first approved, we're seeing like 95 high percentages. Then we get out in the real world and it's a little bit lower. And it's going to feel that way with some of these variants as well when we see how well the vaccine covers it. I don't really have an idea of quite what's going on. I know whenever a new variant is discovered, folks are on top of it and trying to see how well these vaccines work. One of the really cool things about mRNA vaccines is it is very, very easy. Well, easy for someone who's working in the field to manipulate it just a bit to be able to cover some of these variants of concern that may cause trouble in the future. So my understanding is there's a potential that maybe some of our booster doses in the future might look a little bit different in order to better match some of these strains or variants that we're worried about. But for now, we're sticking with the one we have and studying these variants as they come out to see if they are providing protection or not. So I don't really know quite what it's going to look like in the future, but one of the cool things about the mRNA technology is the ability to change it when needed. Also, the child or the vaccine, COVID vaccine for 5 to 11 is already a little bit different in two ways. It's a smaller dose, but they also used a different buffer, I believe, like a different extra ingredient in there to make it more stable or stable longer at different temperatures. Because one of our first concerns was that it needed to be in that super, super cold freezer. And so they're already making slight adjustments to make this more readily available and better fit for different communities that need the vaccine. So they're constantly looking at this stuff and adjusting it as needed. So hopefully we'll have some guidance on that soon if changes are needed.
Well, I have to tell you, this is a super fast hour. I mean, it went by so fast. Thank you so much.
In a
for
good way,
your
I hope, right? Yeah.
Are there any more questions before we wrap it up? I think we're good to go. Thank you so much. Yes,
Of course.
indeed. This was a terrific presentation. We all learned
Great.
something new. And everyone, we will be emailing an evaluation form. And we'd love to hear your feedback on the presentation and any suggestions you might have for future Zoom presentations. If you have any questions, please give us a call at 206-230-0150. And again, thank you so much for joining us. We are having another Zoom event this month, and that's going to be on the 17th. It's called an overview of iPhone and Apple Watch health tools. So we hope you'll join us then. And Larry, go ahead. You can say the final words.
So for our listeners, you know, Dr. Winter, you went over a lot of information. Is there any way you can send us an overview or send, email it to us, and we will send it to our listeners so it can kind of encapsulate what you've talked about today?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I'll provide some of the most important information in a quick handout that you guys can send out to those who logged in.
You are so easy to work with. Thank you so much. We appreciate it very much. And everyone, enjoy the rest of the day. And thank you all for joining us today. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Have a good day.